Imagine this. Your child, small, fists clenched, face red, screams in frustration, kicking the floor in a storm of raw emotion. Your first instinct? To silence it, to correct it, to teach them that anger is unacceptable, that good children stay composed. But what if, in that moment, you are not witnessing a problem to be fixed, but a gift to be understood? What if the very emotion you've been conditioned to suppress is the key to your child's strength, authenticity, and ultimate freedom? We live in a world that fears anger. Parents panic when their children erupt. Teachers punish outbursts, and society rewards compliance. From the earliest age, we are taught anger is dangerous, anger is shameful, anger must be controlled. But what if we've gotten it all backward? Consider this paradox. The children who are never allowed to be angry grow into adults who never learn how to say no. They become people pleasers, trapped in quiet resentment, their boundaries eroded by the fear of conflict. They smile when they should roar. They swallow their pain until it turns into depression, anxiety, or worse, a slow burning self-betrayal. Why does this happen? Because anger is not the enemy. It is the body's most honest alarm system. It is the fire that says, "This is unfair. This hurts. This must change." A child who is never allowed to feel anger is a child who is never taught how to protect themselves. Think of the adult who stays in toxic relationships because they were never allowed to protest as children. Think of the employee who silently endures exploitation because they fear being difficult. Think of the artist who abandons their voice because they learned early that rebellion is punished. This is the hidden cost of suppressing a child's anger, not just a stifled emotion, but a stifled soul. Carl Jung warned of this when he spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we disown, the emotions we exile into darkness. When we teach children that anger is unacceptable, we force it underground, where it mutates into something far more dangerous: passive aggression, self-loathing, or explosive rage later in life. And yet the most resilient, boundary-strong, and emotionally intelligent adults are not those who never felt anger, but those who were taught how to wield it. So here lies the great question. What if, instead of extinguishing your child's anger, you learned to honor it? What if their outbursts were not a sign of failure, but a signal, a cry for guidance, a primal force waiting to be shaped into courage? The answer lies not in control, but in understanding. And that understanding begins where most parents fear to tread. The suppression of anger isn't just a parenting choice, it's a cultural mandate. From the moment a child first screams in frustration, society intervenes. Shh, don't yell. Nice girls don't get angry. Big boys don't cry. The message is clear. Emotional control equals moral goodness. But where did this idea come from? And why does it persist, even when it harms the very children it claims to protect? The fear of chaos. Human civilization has always been terrified of unbridled emotion. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this as the core tension between Dionysian chaos, raw, untamed passion, and Apollonian order, reason, restraint. Societies favor order, predictability, obedience, conformity, because chaos threatens stability. But in our quest for control, we made a fatal error. We confused discipline with repression. A child's anger was never the problem, our fear of it was. The industrialization of childhood. Modern education and parenting didn't evolve to nurture individuality. They evolved to produce efficient workers. The Prussian model of schooling, designed in the 18th century, prioritized obedience over critical thinking. Children were trained to sit still, follow orders, and suppress disruptive emotions. Psychologist Alice Miller called this poisonous pedagogy. The belief that breaking a child's will is necessary for their moral development, but what it truly breaks is their authenticity, the Jungian shadow and the birth of hidden rage. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow explains the danger of suppressed anger. When we force a child to deny their rage, it doesn't disappear. It festers in the unconscious. A child punished for tantrums learns to swallow their fury, until, as an adult, it leaks out as passive aggression or self-sabotage. A child shamed for defiance becomes an adult who can't set boundaries, forever haunted by the ghost of their own unexpressed no. This is why so many well-behaved children grow into adults who struggle with chronic guilt when asserting themselves, people-pleasing at the cost of their own well-being, explosive outbursts after years of forced compliance, the existential betrayal. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that hell is other people, not because others are cruel, but because we internalize their expectations until we lose ourselves. When a child is told, "Your anger is bad," they don't just learn to hide their emotions, they learn to distrust their own instincts. They grow up estranged from their inner voice, forever seeking external validation. This is the great tragedy of suppressed anger. It doesn't create peace, it creates prisoners. But what if there was another way? Not permissiveness, not indulgence, but guidance. Because anger, like fire, is neither good nor evil, it is a force, and forces can be mastered. The child who is never allowed to be angry does not become a docile angel. They become a master of disguise. At first, the suppressions seem successful. The tantrums stop. The protests fade. The child learns to nod, to comply, to bite back their frustration. Parents breathe a sigh of relief. Finally, peace. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous is taking root. The 3 silent revolts of suppressed anger. The body keeps the score. Neuroscience confirms what ancient wisdom always knew: emotions buried alive never die. When a child's anger is chronically dismissed, their nervous system adapts, but at a cost. Cortisol floods their bloodstream, wiring their brain for hypervigilance. Muscle tension becomes chronic, leading to headaches, stomach aches, or autoimmune issues later in life. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, grows hypersensitive, making them prone to anxiety disorders. As physician Gabor Maté warns, not all damaged children act out. Some silently implode. 2. The birth of the false self. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott described the false self, a mask crafted to please others while the true self withers. The child who was shamed for anger learns to perform sweetness. The teenager replaces honest rebellion with secret self-harm. The adult becomes nice at the cost of being real. This is how we create generations of people who can articulate everyone's feelings but their own. 3. The revenge of the shadow. Carl Jung's shadow theory manifests tragically here. The perfect student suddenly drops out of college in a crisis of identity. The agreeable spouse explodes over a trivial slight after decades of swallowed grievances. The timid employee finally snaps, not with healthy assertiveness, but with nuclear resentment. These aren't failures of character. They're the inevitable backlash of emotions denied. The social contagion. This pattern doesn't just harm individuals, it shapes civilizations. Authoritarian regimes rely on citizens trained from childhood to equate anger with shame. Corporations profit from workers who fear conflict too much to demand fair treatment. The justice system punishes violent outbursts while ignoring the repressed rage that fuels them. Philosopher Frantz Fanon saw this clearly. Violence isn't instinctual. It's what happens when legitimate anger has no language. The lost art of righteous fury. History's greatest changemakers weren't those who avoided anger. They were those who harnessed it. Gandhi's quiet fury dismantled an empire. Rosa Parks' contained rage ignited a movement. Every abused child who grows up to say, "never again," to their own children. This is the paradox we've missed. Anger isn't the opposite of love. It's its fierce protector. The child screaming, "it's not fair," isn't misbehaving. They're practicing the very skill that might one day save them from an abusive partner, an exploitative boss, or their own self-betrayal. But how do we cultivate this fire without getting burned? What if we've been wrong about anger all along? Not just in how we manage it, but in how we define it. Modern psychology frames anger as a negative emotion, something to be minimized, therapized, or medicated away. But ancient traditions knew better. The Greeks had thumos, the righteous fire of the soul. The Buddhists speak of compassionate wrath, anger that protects rather than destroys. Even the Bible describes Jesus overturning tables in the temple, not as a loss of control, but as sacred fury against corruption. Anger is not the enemy. Disconnected anger is. The two faces of anger. Reactive anger. The tantrum that demands instant gratification. The lashing out that blames others. The flame without direction. Constructive anger. The deep knowing when a boundary is crossed, the fuel for necessary change, the fire that forges character. The difference isn't in the emotion itself, but in its containment and channeling. This is what we should be teaching children. Not to avoid anger, but to wield it. The alchemy of anger, a parenting paradox. The most emotionally intelligent parents do something radical. They name the anger. I see you're furious right now. They contain it. You can be angry, but you can't hit. They guide it. What is this anger trying to tell us? This transforms anger from a threat into a teacher. Case study: the Viking approach to anger. Norse culture had a fascinating practice. When a warrior felt overwhelming rage, they would withdraw to a sacred space channel, the energy into physical labor, chopping wood, forging metal. Return when clarity emerged. This wasn't suppression, it was sacred transmutation. The neuroscience of healthy anger. Modern research reveals when anger is expressed and validated, the amygdala calms within minutes. Children whose anger is acknowledged develop stronger prefrontal cortex connections. The act of naming emotions literally rewires the brain for emotional regulation. This explains why the child allowed to stomp their feet learns self-control faster than the one forced to calm down. The teenager taught to articulate their rage becomes more emotionally balanced than their perfectly behaved peers. The boundary paradox. Here's the counterintuitive truth. Children who are allowed to say no violently through tantrums grow into adults who can say no peacefully. Why? Because boundaries are muscles. They must be exercised to develop. A child who never rebels becomes an adult who can't resist. There is a moment in every child's life when their anger reveals its true nature, not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a compass pointing toward their deepest values. A 4-year-old screams when her toy is taken, not because she's spoiled, but because she's encountering injustice for the first time. A teenager slams his door after being grounded, not because he's rebellious, but because he's tasting the bitter medicine of consequence. A young adult finally confronts their abusive parent, not to cause pain, but because their soul refuses to betray itself any longer. This is anger in its highest form, the sacred rage of self-preservation. The fire that purifies. Ancient alchemists didn't seek to extinguish fire, they used it to transform base metals into gold. Your child's anger works the same way. It reveals boundaries when they yell, "Stop," as someone takes their toy. It exposes injustice when they sob, "It's not fair," after a broken promise. It forges identity when they rage, "You don't understand me," during teenage years. The healthiest adults aren't those who never felt anger. They're those whose anger was honored and guided into wisdom. The ritual of emotional alchemy. Try this with your child next time they're furious. Sanctify the space. I see this matters deeply to you. Let's figure it out together. Name the dragon. Is your anger saying someone crossed a line, or that something feels unfair? Forge the sword. How can we solve this without hurting others or yourself? This transforms rage from a wildfire into a controlled burn. one that clears emotional brush without destroying the forest. The rebirth of the warrior. Consider how cultures throughout history channeled youthful fury. Spartan boys were taught to direct their aggression into disciplined strength. Samurai children learned that true power meant restraint with readiness. Indigenous rites of passage helped teens ritualize their rage into purpose. We've lost these containers for healthy anger, and our children are paying the price. The final revelation. Here's the truth most parenting books won't tell you. Your child's anger isn't a failure of your parenting. It's the raw material of their character. Every time they protest an unfair rule, they're practicing moral reasoning, resist an unwanted hug. They're learning bodily autonomy. Argue passionately. They're developing critical thinking. The healthiest societies aren't those where children never get angry. They're those where anger becomes sacred fuel rather than shameful secret. The invitation. Next time your child explodes in fury, pause. See beyond the noise to the miracle unfolding. This is the moment their soul whispers, "I matter enough to fight for myself." Your choice isn't between suppressing or indulging their anger, but between crushing their spirit or honoring their fire. The great paradox? Children who are taught to respect their anger grow into adults who rarely need to use it. Because when rage is allowed to speak its truth early and often, it transforms from a destructive force into the quiet, unshakable courage of a soul that knows its worth. And that is the greatest gift you could ever give. If this revelation about your child's anger has unsettled, enlightened, or awakened something in you, then this is why you subscribe. Because here, we don't just discuss parenting. We excavate the buried truths of human nature, the uncomfortable, the controversial, the transformative. We turn fear into wisdom, rage into power, and shadows into light. So hit like if this reframe has shifted something in you. Share it with the parent who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because this is just the beginning. The deeper we go, the more children and the adults they become will reclaim what society has tried to erase, the sacred right to feel deeply, to protest fiercely, and to grow whole. Until next time, stay brave, stay questioning, and most of all, let them roar.